Okay, looks like it's 2:03, so we can get started. My name is David Berger. I am the Chief Technology Officer of Integra Ledger, a blockchain for law. And I'm here to discuss one of the use cases that one of our consortium members did in California. So they are live using the blockchain to help prevent workers' comp fraud. Now I'm supposed to tell you something interesting about myself. I have a pig. So Arcuity is a company that collects medical records during workers' comp. I hurt myself on this trip. I'm doing business. I submit $100,000 worth of medical expenses to my employer. They have to pay it. Now, I live in Nevada. It's not that bad there. In California, it's ultra strict. So last year, I presented about the Integra Ledger, which is what my company does. We basically noticed that the world's ecosystem of documents is kind of crazy. There are millions and billions of documents out there. There's no standard way of referencing documents, of proving something exists. So how does blockchain play into this? What's the solution? So the solution involves setting up a consortium. So people will talk here about we're using Hyperledger Fabric. Hyperledger Fabric can help act as a registry or a database, if you want to think about it that way, an immutable database of document records, not the documents, but just the fingerprints, the hashes, so you can prove that a document existed at a given time. And so our focus is on proof of existence of the document, not on things like smart contracts, despite the fact we're a legal blockchain. So if you go to many of the other sessions, they're going to talk about complete solutions, controlling every aspect of a supply chain, for example, on Hyperledger Fabric. And those are great business models. They're good design patterns. It's not what I believe in. I believe in keeping things as brutally simple as possible. The absolute minimum on the ledger, only what it's useful for. So really what we expect people to do, for example, file storage should be left to SharePoint or the document management systems, and they should use a simple API to hit what we're doing. So I presented the fact we had built a consortium of 200 companies and law firms last year. We're at 350 now, so we got the consortium up. The problem is everyone was saying, well, what's the use case? Why is it useful? We only have a contract argued once a year or once a month. Why is this such a big deal? So in the year, we ran into what is probably the perfect use case, is workers' comp fraud. So does anyone want to yell out what you think the amount of money workers' comp cases against California companies cost the state? Anyone? It's actually $1 to $3 billion a year. So all of a sudden, people care an awful lot about proof of existence of whether it's a subpoena, whether it's a medical record. And one would assume that the biggest problem was fraud from individuals. As I said, I hurt my knee because the plane was bad, or something more serious. The event planner at my company forgot to list I have a peanut allergy and I ate some peanuts, and I'm going to sue for $100,000. Turns out the much bigger issue is organized crime, groups of doctors. So there are crime syndicates that will get large groups of doctors to get, they'll go to South America, for example, in Central America, and import migrant workers and just crank through phony claims. Oh, I hurt my knee. I need a urine test. Hey, the companies, the medical providers don't share records. I'm going to get 20 urine tests. And this adds up very quickly. So in other words, the proof of existence that a patient going to a doctor hasn't happened before, the proof that the doctor is board certified, the proof when you go to the pharmacy that the medicine has been prescribed only once. It's basically a supply chain issue. So take anything you hear about the supply chains with Walmart and McDonald's and the various other companies you've heard about on the ledger, and imagine applying that to workers' comp. And one of the things that makes this a perfect storm issue is HIPAA. So one would think that there would be a dozen or 24 companies here that are doing medical records on the blockchain. It seems a perfect thing. The problem is privacy is such an extreme issue. Right now, it's a little bit difficult to get around. Workers' comp waives the HIPAA requirements. So you can actually put personal identifiable information on a publicly shared ledger for the greater good so that the law firms can review and look at the information. So I had mentioned that we built the consortium. So that was a lot harder than we thought, although we're up to 350 members, as I said, which is fairly big. Turns out the hard thing, since this is supposed to be a technical deep dive, was building a blockchain that crossed the cloud providers. I want some on Amazon, AWS, some on Microsoft Azure, on-premises versus not. We found some of the law firms won't allow third-party code in their data center, and some that absolutely wouldn't trust the cloud at all. So we were originally going to use IBM Blockchain Platform, and they were a little bit late in delivering that ability. Although if you go to the booth now, everything is Kubernetes driven, and they absolutely support that now. We ended up going to a small Indian offshore group that had solved the issue. And they did, Debut Infotech is their name, they did all of the development. It turns out they're here, they're one of the sponsors, and they're here, and they're talking later about exactly how they conquered the issue of being able to run across platform. So rather than going into detail about what they did, you should go and speak with them and go to their presentation later. So it turns out that the approach we took was to make things brutally simple. Rather than hitting the technical problems, we're going to leave that to Hyperledger. They've done a great job. And I'm going to leave it to the hardcore engineers. We're going to focus on the social issue. So I used to say it's 95% social and 5% technical. It's probably at this point more like 99% social. So a year ago, I announced that we had an identity service, proof of existence, and a key registry. So proof of existence is the main use case. I'm a process server. I'm going to Kaiser Permanente. I serve you. Give me all of the medical records for Mary Martinez. And one of the things we announced last year is we work with Serve Manager to help blockchain the record of that. So that could have been used in workers' comp. It turns out that we realized what would be even better was to make sure that you digitally signed the serving record. So we built an iPad app. It issued a public-private key pair. So when the process server goes to Kaiser Permanente, the actual process serve document will embed the GPS location into the PDF, sign it with their digital signature, and the hash of that record is what goes onto the ledger. So think about this. Our entire blockchain is one channel, one really simple smart contract, which is effectively an asset registry with like 5 string values. We've raised $3.5 million on that concept. You do not need to overthink this. So it turns out that I was even overthinking this with pointing out there are 3 services. So a friend of mine works for Hyperledger, and I don't want to misquote him, so I won't say who it is, but he was telling me at Hyperledger, they've come to the conclusion that all of it boils down to just identity. So these aren't separate things, they're all one and the same. So I don't know whether they really feel that, but I certainly do at this point. So it's not the obvious thing. So I started with Composer last year. Composer was a great product. It put an abstraction layer. It made it really easy to write your smart contracts and model things. IBM was the main sponsor. They decided not to pursue it. The Hyperledger released the Node SDK and made it a first-class citizen. It's great. We rewrote our Composer code in one afternoon. So we're using vanilla Hyperledger Fabric 1.4, and we're using the Node SDK. So again, very simple asset registry, very simple API. You register data. There are 2 API calls to pull it back, either by the hash value or by the ID. And I'm playing around with two different API calls to register an identity and pull it back. Now, it turns out that the system about identity has gotten so much more complicated than I can handle. So by the time I sit through the sessions tomorrow on identity, I will probably be schooled and redo a bunch of this. But again, the key is, if you're going to hash the document, got to add some randomness to it, salt it. And if you don't digitally sign it with an identity, it's not going to serve you any good. So I had mentioned that the supply chain, the medical records and workers' comp fraud was effectively a supply chain. So this is one of the slides from ArcuityVizion's actual deck, and you can see the various places where the medical records move between and the record. And again, this is from their slide deck, so you can see what they're focusing on. Proof of existence. It turns out that if a law firm gets involved and they miss one of the hospitals, they could be sued for malpractice. So the quality of the data becomes really important. So one thing that people talk about is the marriage between AI and blockchain. This is a really good example. Blockchain helps guarantee the quality of the data. I can tell who it's coming from, whether it's a doctor or even an X-ray or a high-end scanning machine, IoT. The better the quality the data is, the better you can run analysis. So if I have a minute at the end, I'm going to actually get off blockchain and show you the full-text search engine that we helped build for them. So I discussed what was going on. So it turns out, as I said, this is 98% social. So we had realized the key to getting acceptance was to get the lawyers, the decision makers, to buy into the technology. Blockchain seems so foreign, and even though they tend to be 10 years behind in their thinking, they're used to digitally signed PDFs. They know DocuSign, they know Adobe Sign, so they'll buy that. So we started focusing more and more on hashes of documents. And then we realized, well, you could embed metadata in the document, and you could help use the blockchain to enforce schemas. And I started going all crazy, and it turned out we discovered our killer app for last year, QR code. I sent this to my boss as a kind of a cute thing. Hey, here's a QR code. It can point to the blockchain record. And we pointed it to the Blockchain Explorer at first, and then built our own little custom page. This is the killer app. This is what we show to law firms, and they go, wow, can you put one on every page? Can you put a logo? So believe it or not, the most impactful thing we possibly show is the QR code. The lesson is this is a gradual social experiment to get people used to the other technology. Once we start getting them used to having the process servers in, maybe we could get the doctors and maybe the pharmacy, but we want to make this as simple as possible. So what does this allow for in the end? Once all the documents floating around, you can guarantee the provenance and the quality of them. You can start doing analysis. So this is a screenshot of the AI system that I helped build for them. So I'm both the CTO of Integra Ledger and I'm a technical advisor for these for Arcuity. So the blockchain piece and this little piece is what I talk with them about. So let me go. So imagine that, again, I've hurt myself. I've seen 10 doctors. The doctors, each of the doctors write up extensive notes, a lot of it handwritten. I'm going to sue. In the average case, costs a couple $100,000. So before paying out the money, they're going to pay a law firm to review the records. So the higher quality the data is, the more they can run tools, because they're not having high-end lawyers. That's too expensive. The average lawyer is a couple $100 an hour. So they really needed a tool that will allow the lower level associates to be able to really crank through the data and trust it. Blockchain is all about building trust. So the average number of pages of medical records for a case in California is around 100. So let me look for left shoulder pain. And what we've actually done is take that, what we call a smart document, so it's a verified PDF carrying metadata. This got dropped in Azure's cognitive search, which, if anyone knows, it's a full text search engine that sits on top of Lucene, but it required almost no programming to get this in. So all of a sudden, the text is all there. And one of the things that you can do in a full text search engine is add extra metadata fields and do much more complex searches. So imagine as we get more and more of the members of the supply chain that the records are going through, that we're tagging. We're actually taking the geolocation of where, not only where it's served, but let's say it's Amazon has warehouses and has actually talked with Arcuity. They have warehouses, so they're monitoring every last thing. So if Amazon started taking their sensor data and recording it and could get married with this PDF document, the lawyers could do searches finding out, well, this is inconsistent. And when you go to court and basically someone says, well, I was in the North Wing and this thing fell over, Amazon can produce their records. Remember, we don't store the data on the blockchain, just the hash, but they can go, look, here are our logs. And by the way, if we hash these and digitally sign with their key, you can see the key matches what was on the Integra ledger, therefore you throw it out. So again, the absolute minimum on the ledger, and it's more about building transparency and trust in the records, in the companies, in the entire process, and that fuels the ability to automate and process and get new insights into the data. Thank you. So So a lawyer would log into ArcuityVizion's website and request medical records for Mary Martinez. They would then send process servers out with the Integra Sign app to serve the process. They would get the information in. ArcuityVizion would then sequence all of the medical records into one. They then, this gets a little bit complicated, I can walk it through, but you have a little bit of a problem. If they simply hashed that PDF file and signed it and recorded it, that's easy enough to do. But if you want to put metadata or the QR code in, inserting that will change it. So there are a couple of ways of doing it, but one easy way to do it would be they sequence 100 pages, they register that on the ledger returns an ID for the blockchain, and you use that as a foreign key if you want, so ArcuityVizion or the third party can store that in the system. You then insert the QR code and hash it again, and the QR code could contain the blockchain ID. We do something specific I don't want to go into, but for example, if you had Fabric's transaction ID, the QR code could then point to an instance of the blockchain explorer, or in our case, it just points to an API endpoint which hits the server. And talking all of this through, I said we were using Composer originally. Composer used a tool called Loopback that IBM had developed that automatically generated the API, which was very nice. With the Fabric SDK, you can very easily use standard Node, pull any article of off Medium about building an API for Node, and throw in the Node SDK, and you can get this going. Basically, the difference between Fabric sitting as a backend isn't all that much different than saying, oh, I'm using SQL Server or a NoSQL database or a graph database. As far as I'm concerned, it just had different restrictions and properties, and that's the way it should be. So the QR code is just a pointer to the record. We originally thought it was just a convenience thing. One thing I'm working on now is to actually put a QR code next to each signature line, and actually building the iOS apps where you could actually, you generate your public-private key, and actually put the private key in a vault on your iPhone or Android, and when you actually scan the QR code, it would be a legal signature going on. So if we can do that, imagine that every doctor, every physical therapist had on their iPad that they had to sign along the process. Well, sounds like we're good. Any other questions?
So if the data is kept off-chain, who actually owns that data?
So in this case, ArcuityVizion provides the record. So a company pays ArcuityVizion goes out and process serves it. They put their PDFs on the ArcuityVizion server and they're DRM'd, but the company, so Amazon or Acme Widget Corp has the rights to download the PDFs. But ArcuityVizion keeps a copy on it, so you can use tools like the full text search engine. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for watching, and pull me aside if you want any more detail.